In the summer of 1990, in a quiet college town in north central Florida, 5 young people were murdered in a span of just 4 days. They were students, freshmen most of them, kids who had just unpacked their boxes, taped up their posters, and gone to sleep in unfamiliar beds, dreaming about the lives they were finally about to begin. None of them knew that a man was already watching, that he had chosen his town, bought his knife, and pitched his tent in the woods at the edge of campus, and that he was, at this very moment, deciding which window to stand outside of first. What no one in that town could have known is that the fear about to descend on Gainesville would outlast every one of its victims. It would outlast the man who caused it, and 6 years later it would move into movie theaters across the world, because the screenwriter, alone and frightened one night, would turn what happened here into the most famous monsters in film history. But that is the end of this story. First, you have to understand the man in the trees. His name was Danny Rolling. And to understand how one man could paralyze an entire city with fear, how he could turn a simple act of turning off the bedroom light into an act of terror, you have to understand something uncomfortable. He wasn't born a monster. He was made into one, slowly, deliberately, over 36 years. This is the story of how. It begins in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1954. A baby is born to a young mother and father who did not want him, and who would spend the next 3 decades making sure the boy knew it. The father was a police officer, a man who wore authority on his uniform by day and enforced it with his fists at night. Neighbors would later describe a household run on fear. The boy was beaten for the smallest things, for laughing wrong, for breathing wrong. He was told again and again that he was an accident, that he was worthless, and that he would never amount to anything. Plenty of children survive cruelty like this and never harm another living soul. Cruelty is not the cause. It's not an excuse. But in this particular boy, in this particular house, something was quietly taking shape. A wound that would never close. Because the boy started leaving at night. He'd slip out the back door into the dark and walk the neighborhood alone. And he developed a habit, a strange, lonely habit that would define the rest of his life. He would stop outside other people's houses, and he would look in through the windows. He'd watch families eat dinner. He watched them laugh, and he watched them from the darkness, from the warmth that he was never given. And a single question began to rot inside of him. Why them? Why not me? A boy in the dark staring through a lit window at a life he can't have, because he's going to spend the next 36 years chasing that feeling. And the day he finally stops chasing it and starts destroying it is the day people begin to die. By his teens, the watching had turned into something darker. He was arrested for peeping. He started drinking, and the petty crimes stacked up. The way they often do. Small, then less small, then serious. He tried to escape himself. The military, marriage, religion. For one brief window, at 20 years old, married with a baby daughter, it looked like Danny Rolling might just make it out. Then his wife left him. And that rejection, being cast aside, being told once again that he was not enough, broke something that was already barely holding on. What followed was almost a decade lost to armed robbery and prison. And when he finally walked out in 1989, 35 years old, he had nothing. No wife, no career, no future. Just a childhood bedroom in his father's house. A lifetime of being told he was a failure. So Danny Rolling made a decision. If he could not succeed at living, he would succeed at something else. His first victims were an entire family. A young woman, Julie Grissom, her father, and her 8-year-old nephew. He walked in through an unlocked door and took all three. And when it was over, he did something that would become his signature. He cleaned the scene. He arranged it, carefully and deliberately, the way an artist steps back from a canvas. Because to him, it wasn't murder. For the first time in his life, he believed he had done something well, and he had gotten away with it completely. That is the most dangerous moment in this entire story. Not the violence itself, but the silence that followed it. There were no sirens, no handcuffs, nothing. He crossed the most unthinkable line a human being can cross, and the world had simply let him walk away. A man like that doesn't stop. He escalates. And in May of 1990, he pointed his car toward Florida, toward Gainesville, a university town full of the exact thing that he had envied since he was a boy in the dark. Young people, hopeful people, people with futures. He stopped along the way and bought a military combat knife. He bought that weapon before he ever arrived. This was not rage. This was a plan. On the night of August 23rd, two freshmen, 17 and 18 years old, were settling into their new apartment. He watched them through the window, the way he always had, and in the dark hours before dawn, he forced their sliding door with a screwdriver and went inside. By morning, both were gone. Before their bodies were even discovered, he had already chosen his next. Barely a day later, another student, and what he did to her was so savage that investigators believed he wasn't seeing her at all. He was seeing the wife who had left him all those years ago. And still the town had no idea. He wasn't slowing down. He was accelerating. That same day, he broke into a fourth apartment expecting another young woman alone. But this time, the roommate was home, a tall, powerfully built athlete named Manuel. And Manuel did not go quietly. He fought this man in the dark for his life, buying seconds that no one would ever hear about. It wasn't enough. 5 students, 4 days, and then the city of Gainesville simply broke. Students fled campus in the middle of the semester. Parents drove through the night to drag their children home. Gun stores emptied their shelves. The entire community locked its doors and sat awake in the dark, waiting for a killer who had no name and no face. And here's where the case takes a turn that is almost impossible to believe. Because the police arrest the wrong man, a troubled local teenager. And for a few days, the town exhales. They think it's over. Then the DNA comes back. It isn't him. The real killer is still out there. And the panic returns twice as strong. So how do you catch a ghost? You catch him with the smallest, most human detail imaginable. Years earlier, in a bakery, Danny Rolling had lost part of his finger to a slicing machine. One more small humiliation in a life full of them. And at that very first crime scene, investigators had recovered something that they hadn't understood at the time. A partial handprint pressed into a surface with a single finger missing. For weeks, it meant nothing until an agent mentions, almost in passing, that a gun in a local robbery had been sold to a drifter with a missing finger. The room goes silent. The robber and the killer are the same man, and that man was already sitting in a jail cell, arrested for holding up a grocery store. They tested his DNA against the murders, and it matched. The most feared man in Florida was not brought down by a brilliant manhunt. He was brought down by his own pettiness, the same compulsive small-time crime that had defined his entire wasted life. In court, he pleaded guilty to all of it, and on the night before his execution, he confessed to the Grissom family too, writing in his own hand that it was his hand that took those precious lights out of this old dark world. On October 25th, 2006, Danny Rolling was executed. He was 52 years old. But by the time Danny Rolling was strapped to that gurney, the fear he'd created had already outrun him. 4 years after the murder, in 1994, a young screenwriter named Kevin Williamson was house-sitting alone when he turned on an ABC News special about the Gainesville killings. Something in it burrowed into him. When it ended, he noticed a window in the house standing open, one he was certain that he had never touched. He called a friend. He picked up a kitchen knife, and he moved through the house room by room, convinced that someone was outside in the dark watching him. By the time the sun came up, he had already started writing. The script would become a film called Scream, and its killer, the one who watches his victims through their windows before he strikes, turned an entire generation's fear of the dark into a mask you'd recognize anywhere. Almost none of the people that movie ever terrified had ever even heard the name Danny Rolling, but the fear we all feel is his. We want our monsters to look like monsters. We want to be able to see them coming. But the man who terrorized an entire city, who took 8 lives, was small, forgettable, ordinary. A failure who killed in the end for one reason: to prove to himself that he was finally good at something.